listening to Resist and Restore, a podcast from the Circle of Hope Pastors, where we're extending the table of our dialogue. I'm Jonny Rashid. I use he, him pronouns.
I'm Rachel Sensenig. I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Julie Hoke. I use she, her pronouns.
Welcome to our second episode of Season 3. We have a lot of exciting things happening here. Me and my homie Jim Getz, he's a professor at Temple, and he is a member of Circle of Hope. He's going to share some insights about how to read the Bible now, how to read the Old Testament particularly, because he is learned in that field. So I am very much looking forward to the conversation I have with him, and I hope it blesses you as well, to get into some details about how to read through difficult passages and how to read the Bible from a 21st century lens, looking back at this first century New Testament and even older Old Testament. So I hope that helps you engage with the text. We'll end with spiritual show and tell, but we'll start with talkback, and Julie's going to help us get going there.
This is an unusual thing for us, but we wanted to talk back to our episode, our first episode of this season last week. There were things that I was chewing on even after we recorded that I wanted to loop back to, and Rachel too. We were reflecting on that together. So we're going to talk back to our own episode. Rachel, you want to get us started?
Sure. I wanted to offer more clarity around what I said about our founding pastors moving on. To be more specific, one of our founding pastors resigned and one retired. And then we asked them to take a pause on involvement in the church, to allow the church to come into some new patterns. And relationally, that was really hard. And it's allowing our current leaders to step into their fullness in new ways. So it's kind of a both and. Do you want to say any more about that, Jonny or Julie?
We learned a lot about how to do transitions through this, and we were left being a better church because we have guidelines for how to leave well. We've had pastors retire or resign in the past, and for one reason or another, they didn't stick around the church, and so we never really had to confront what it looked like for a pastor who formerly led to worship with the congregation as no longer being a leader. And that just gave us challenges that we didn't foresee as a body, and we learned it the hard way, to be honest. And there was no shortage of pain, for anybody involved. And I think that specifically our racial minorities felt it in a unique way. And I know I did. And I still carry a lot of pain in my body because of that, and a lot of fear and a lot of emotions. And I'm changed as a result too. The church changed for the better, and I changed too, and became more in touch with certain desires and feelings within me. So it was a very transformative process, with the newness that we discovered as a church, and with the newness that I discovered as an individual. There's joy, there's desire, there's passion in that, but there's also no shortage of anguish too. And I guess that's just what it is to be someone who grows and changes and learns. There is some pain, there is some anguish. And if we want to avoid that forever, we may not grow into the next thing, and we may not even be able to be the wounded healers that Jesus calls us to be. So all of that to say is it was painful, it was difficult. But it's hard to say I regret it, because here we are now, ready to do something new, with a new map on the way and a new direction for the church, and that's exciting. It was a costly journey, though. So, I wouldn't look forward to enduring that again, to change another time or something. But this is where we are right now.
Yeah, I wanted to acknowledge, Jonny, you, in our last episode, you talked about some of that pain, and specifically your experience of trauma and abuse and racism. And just naming that, takes a lot of courage. And I wanted to acknowledge that I have come to see that in our church, in myself, in our patterns, in all new ways through this whole process of transformation. And I think your courage to be able to say it, speaking the truth in love is essential for our ability to make changes, to repent, to heal, to recover, to grow into this new thing that God is doing in the church right now. So I appreciate your vulnerability in that, and I don't want to leave you alone because I've experienced it too with you. We've undergone a lot in this last year, and your experience of that as our only BIPOC pastor, you've borne the weight of that and the just the racialized experience of this in a whole different way. So the fact that you've shared that with me has transformed me and helped me to come to understand what it requires to really change to be an anti-racist church, to take on that identity. Anyway, I'm rambling now and I don't want to, so I'm going to stop. But I just want to say, I just wanted to loop back to that to say something, because my silence was like deafening in my ears last week.
Glad you could share that, Julie. And, if I can offer this to you, don't ever think you need to say the right thing in the moment and you can't go back to it and share it later, right? We have a long life together. There's plenty of time to talk. So talk back to us too, y'all. We want to hear from you. Go to Resist and Restore podcast at circleofhope.net to do so. Before we get to the next section, could I mention something else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Last Monday, which feels like it could have been like a year ago, a draft opinion from the Supreme Court leaked to the press. And in that opinion, as you might know, was evidence that it was clear that the Supreme Court was going to overrule Roe v. Wade, a 1973 landmark ruling that protected the right to have an abortion. 3 President Trump appointees, a Reagan appointee, and a Bush appointee voted to affirm this. And Donald Trump said, I will put justices in place that overturn Roe. He said it will happen automatically, right? So this was something we expected, but also something we were shocked by. I was shocked by, I should say. So just speaking for myself, and the pastors will join me as well with what they want to say, but we acknowledge how devastating this is for women seeking pregnancy, women that are pregnant, women that have to now have a fundamentally more dangerous pregnancy because of this ruling, and it's frightening to me because of that. It's frightening to me because the precedent set was based on a little clause in the 14th Amendment that says that the Constitution protects rights that it doesn't name so long as they're deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. Roe is 50 years old, but the American Disabilities Act is 30 years old. Obergefell versus Hodges, the case that legalized gay marriage, is only 7 years old. So, who knows what other rights can be infringed because of this. So it sets a dangerous precedent, and it's also dangerous on its face. I am afraid women will die as a result of this ruling. And that's a scary, that's just a scary time. It's a scary thing. It's a scary time to be alive, So it's just another, burden that vulnerable people have to hold.
Right. Yeah, we're feeling it in our congregation around South Broad, too. We stood in solidarity this past Sunday and prayed particularly for women facing unwanted pregnancies right now in this new uncertainty, especially those who may not have resources or, like you're saying, Jonny, health, the physical health to get through a pregnancy. There's a lot of there's a lot of increased burden placed upon women. And Jesus cares about that. And we care. And so I'm glad you brought this up.
Yeah, the possibility of abortion comes, or the need for it, the question of it often comes at the end of a long line of other unaddressed quality of life, basic human right, healthcare issues. And those things don't get talked about or get anywhere near the airtime or the consideration or the advocacy that abortion does. And that I don't want us to lose that piece of this conversation, because it is so important to recognize that because of the way our society, because of the way racism and other oppressions, anti-immigration, all kinds of things work, and the legislation around all of that works in our society, it leaves women in very vulnerable and difficult situations. And so this overthrow of the legislation is devastating. Jonny, you said you weren't surprised, but like I'm still shocked, honestly.
I was shocked, but I shouldn't have been, because they said this. They
said it, yeah.
So like, yes, I can't. I don't believe they had the audacity to do it. And I mean, I don't want to get all technical, but like, 3 of the justices, Alito, Thomas, and ACB Barrett, the new one, I'm not shocked about. I didn't expect Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, even Kavanaugh, Jesus, sorry, to do it. But then they did. I mean, it's just like, it's really heavy.
Yeah, I want to put a plug in here for Resmaa Menacem's new book, The Quaking of America. He's writing to try and prepare folks to continue trying to create an anti-racist culture in this systemic mess, oppressive mess that is just kind of heating up. It feels like a really important book to me. I was surprised too, Julie, and then I thought, wait, I shouldn't be surprised. I was just reading Resmaa's words. But it's distressing nonetheless, and I hope we can keep working together.
And keep your heart soft. Keep being shocked when the worst things happen. Like, we don't have to get cold and cynical. We can hope for good things and then be disappointed. Like that's a better place to be in, right? Than like just cynical and saying, yeah, of course this happened, and now I'm cold and dead inside. Feel the pain. That's good for us too. Thanks so much for listening to our podcast. We want you to feel like you're with us. So like, talk back to us, make a connection, dialogue with us. Again, Resist and Restore Podcast at circleofhope.net is where you can send your emails to. But and then also tell us what you like about this podcast. When you leave us a review, give us a 5-star review where you listen, and then that'll help other people see us too. And subscribe to the podcast, and then share it with people that you think would be touched by it. We're looking for people who are looking for us. So think about people among you who would be blessed by this and offer it to them. You can keep track with what's going on at Circle of Hope at circleofhope.church. You can find our daily prayer there, as well as other resources. And you can also share money with us if that's something you're willing to do. It helps keep this podcast going and helps keep the church going. There's a giving section. And that'll help you get involved too. You can plug into cells or Sunday meetings that are online or meeting in homes or in person, in rooms, in buildings that we have. So participate as you can. We want to include you from whatever distance that you are. You're part of our family, and we care about you. So talk back to us, connect with us, relate to us. We love you. Hey friends, I'm really excited to have my friend, partner in the church, Dr. James Getz, with us. I call him Jim. Jim's an intellectual heritage professor at my alma mater, Temple University, Intellectual Heritage is a cool course. So he teaches IH, as we call it. He also has a PhD in what?
Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis.
And your dissertation was on dead corpses?
Comparison of Canaanite and biblical rituals, comparing status change.
Oh, okay.
Temporary status change. So like
corpses had nothing to do with it?
I mean, it's a tiny amount, because like if you touch a corpse, it causes problems, sancticontagia, all that. But yeah.
Later on this season, we're going to have Matt Thiessen on, who wrote a book called Jesus and the Forces of Death, which kind of relates to the uncleanliness that you're talking about. But that's a whole different conversation. Okay. Today, what we want to talk about is how do we read the Bible, and specifically the Old Testament, in our 21st century context, knowing that it comes from a whole different place. And then we want to touch on common mistakes and errors and problems that 21st century interpreters of the Bible, which that's all of us, if you read the Bible, make when we read it. So I hope this conversation stimulates others to read and engage with the text, and to do so with more knowledge and more background about it. So I personally rely on Jim a lot when I'm doing my own biblical study. So I hope to share some of what he's offered me with you too. Does that sound good, Jim?
Sounds great.
So I think this is a question that probably really has to be answered before we can open the Bible and use it usefully or understand it. But first of all, the Bible is a compilation of a series of writings, right? And it doesn't necessarily have a fundamental cohesion to it. So we put it together for a variety of purposes in worship, in liturgy, and in religion. So we're looking at this ancient compilation of texts as interpreters right now in the 21st century in a much different society. What does it mean for us to be interpreters now of this ancient scripture?
Yeah, before you get to that, there's the idea of cohesion and all. It's interesting. There have been all these studies that have been done on coherence. One of my doctoral advisors, Mark Brettler, did a lot of work on coherence when he was working on the book of Judges, because Judges is a bunch of these little tiny stories, and does it cohere as one book and whatever. And part of the research that's out there is that if you tell people something is a whole and it's coherent, our brain will naturally try to make it fit together. Mm-hmm. And so there is that sense right off the bat of just the fact that it's all put together as one text, automatically starts especially like parts of our lizard brain want to find those connections, even if they're there or not. So that idea of coherence and cohesion, we always want to find that as human beings. It's sort of how we're hardwired. So that's one thing that's important to realize, because sometimes we see cohesion and coherence where there isn't any, because it's just our natural way of looking at this. So someone gives you a bunch of stuff and said, this all goes together. You're going to start with the premise it does, even if it doesn't. So that's one thing to think about when you're doing this. There's this natural inclination of us as human beings to find cohesion or coherence in things, even if it doesn't exist there. And that's part of the reason why when you're talking about like biblical studies and a lot of what's been done in what's referred to as higher criticism in biblical studies for the last 150, 200 years, which is oftentimes finding different layers in the text, whether it be things like the documentary hypothesis, the idea of four different sources in Pentateuch, or we're talking about different layers, 2 or 3 source or 4 source theory, even in the Gospels. There's also this fight against this of like, I don't see this. I don't think that there needs to be this idea of having this. We can read it just flat. Well, of course you can.
Yeah, totally.
So there those kinds of things happen when we're starting to talk about cohesion and coherence. And it's tricky when we're trying to look at the Bible because it is this smear of history. There are parts of it that are, over 3,000 years old, and parts of it that are, 1,000 years more recent or more. So those kinds of issues get in the sometimes and become problematic when where we want to put things together that might not necessarily go together, and also the idea of it's a smear of history, but there's also a lot of different genres involved.
Totally.
And looking at Psalms and Proverbs, or looking at individual verses of Proverbs as if they are prophecies, is problematic. And especially Proverbs, where you have literally sometimes Proverbs that are exactly opposite to each other, right next to each other.
Yeah.
Right. And it's intentional because they're aphoristic sayings. Sometimes this one will work for you. Sometimes this one over here will work for you. And the wisdom is actually knowing which saying to use at which time. Right. But again, if you read them, you read it all as a flat text that should be read the same way as, say, the words of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, it's going to be a problem. It's going to lead to some very interesting choices in your liturgy or your life.
So to give you an example to the listening audience, if you look at Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5, right? Do not answer fools according to their folly, lest you be a fool yourself. 5, answer fools according to their folly, lest they be wise in their own eyes. So you can see, actually, if you read it together, you can see what's happening. But if you separate it and try to extract a principle from it, it doesn't really work.
Right. And again, and it's part, and that's part of sort of how the genre of Proverbs works, that idea. And especially if you look at those later aphoristic, those little individual one sentence Proverbs, devoid from the first couple of chapters, which is more of this sort of this is where wisdom comes from. This is how you have to get into that wisdom way of thinking. And now here's a bunch of things that might work depending on your situation. But oftentimes people will just go to chapter 20, chapter 24, and not look at chapters 1 through 9 of Proverbs, which is really setting those ideas of prophecy. Right. And I mean, we can look at other places where the scriptures, different scriptures are saying very different things, and you have to put them in their own context and whatnot. Yeah.
So our society is a lot different than the ones that existed during the times of the Bible. What are the things you think we need to know to appreciate those differences? Is it even it seems like a huge leap, honestly. Even as I'm talking about this, to think about, we're looking through a fairly narrow lens, the Bible, at a whole group of people in a society. And we, especially in I would say in Christianity, we rely so heavily on the revelation of the Bible to us. But it's really coming from a whole different place. So what do you think we need to understand about first century Palestine or the ancient Near East in particular before we approach the text? Is there anything that you think is, there's tons of stuff.
There's tons of things, right? One thing, it's important to realize you only have that narrow focus, right? That the Bible isn't, you're finding yourself, this is readily apparent when you read, for example, the epistles, when you read the letters of the New Testament, where you're literally getting one side of a conversation. And it's frustrating sometimes to try to read that, because we don't know what's happening on the other side. And they're written for very particular people in a very particular situation. A few of them aren't. A few of them are more general, like Romans, for example, seems to be, since it's sort of this is Paul sending his CV to Rome, but he's never been there yet. But a lot of them are dealing with extreme particulars, and as such, that might not work for us as individuals today, in different contexts, right? They're not saying it won't at all. It's just you have to understand what that conversation was that was happening. And along the same lines, even when we understand what's happening in this conversation, it's not like everybody in this was in that group. When we have those kinds of discussions going on, we see, I mean, the things we know in our own world, right? When people like use this broad brush to like talk about millennials or something like that, right? Where we understand these things as caricatures, or having rhetorical power because we live in that culture. But if we were separated by 2,000 years, it might be a little bit more problematic to figure that out. And then you add on top of that, of course, the fact that this is the Bible, this is scripture, this is something that we see as authoritative. There becomes more of that idea that we can just pick out little bits and not put them in the right context. But again, like, I bring up the epistles because they're the obvious example. You have this happening with at all levels of what's going on there. There's always a larger conversation that's happening.
Sure.
In the Hebrew Bible, there are all these places for example, in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, where it will talk about aren't the rest of the deeds of what happened here in this other book? Go look them up. And we don't have those other books, right? So they're like, yeah, and if you need to know more about this, go over here. And we don't have it anymore.
We don't have them.
And so that's right. So we know that there's a larger conversation happening, and they're excerpting it to make a certain point, a certain theological point, a certain philosophical point, or rhetorical point. But there's this part of its own larger discussion. And so, yeah, that's all over the place when we're looking at the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Totally. I always find it interesting to compare the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament, because a lot of times people use those terms interchangeably, but they're actually different things, largely based on the order of the books, right?
Somewhat. Yeah, the order of the books is part of it. So Old Testament obviously has a theologically charged meaning.
It's pointing to Jesus, right?
Right, you're pointing to Jesus. It assumes if there's an Old Testament, there's a New Testament, right? So there's already an assumption. There's a theological assumption being made there. In Judaism, usually the term they would use is the Tanakh, and that's the term they would use. That is oftentimes used for the Hebrew scriptures. The term Hebrew Bible is something that's kind of come up as sort of a medial position that's trying to come up with a phrase or term that is not theologically loaded.
Yeah.
So it's a neologism, just trying to create to allow for more ecumenical discussion between Christians and Jews. But usually it's given in the order of the books in the Tanakh. So the Torah first, then the Nevi'im or the prophets, and then the writings at the back. So, which is a little bit different than a Christian Bible.
One of the things that's interesting to me is that in pointing to Jesus, the book of Ruth is placed in one area of history for Israel, right? So like it's related to David, and it's pointing to Jesus in that way. But in the Tanakh, I believe it's right next to Ezra and Nehemiah, right?
It's one of the megalith. There are these 5 books that are used in the liturgical cycle of the Jewish year, and I can't remember if it's right next to. I should know this, but I can't remember if it's now. Now you make me want. I'm going to go grab a Bible. Hold on one second.
Go ahead.
This is part of the problem that happens when you study different canonical orders over and over again, is that you wind up not being able to find anything in any Bible. There you go. In the original Hebrew Bible, it's the last part of the Bible is Psalms, then Proverbs, and Job, and then there is Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentation, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And those books are in the sequence because you read Song of Songs at Passover, you read Ruth during the festival of booths or weeks, Sukkot. You read Lamentations on the 4th of Av. Sorry, not Sukkot. Weeks, Passover weeks, 4th of Av, you read Ecclesiastes on Sukkot, and then Esther on Purim at the end of the year. So they're put in that order because that's those 5 books are read in their entirety on those different festival days. Well, special days, holy days. There's not a feast, obviously, on the 4th of Av.
So you were talking about how the Old Testament in the Christian tradition implies that there's a New Testament and it points us to Jesus. Can I just ask you, in your opinion, and you're a Christian, so you're going to bring your own perspective, but are Christians reappropriating or appropriating Jewish scriptures for their own purposes, and what problems does that bring?
I mean, this is one of those questions that I think everybody has to deal with as a Christian in some respects, is that it's a tricky situation. I mean, you have this happen obviously in other religious traditions as well. The relationship of different forms of Hinduism, what's going on there, and Buddhism and things like that, their relationship to each other, and Jainism, all that kind of stuff. But obviously, we have to worry about this as well on our own front. And I don't know. There needs to be. Those are good examples too from further east in Asia, because you're dealing with traditions they're both still there. And that's kind of the tricky bit, is how do you deal with that? And obviously, historically, Christianity hasn't dealt with it very well.
Right.
Christendom has, if Christianity comes of age in the late Hellenistic Empire, which already had extreme form of different layers of pogroms and whatnot against Jewish people, and then so that was just already the cultural milieu, and then they add other things on top of it based on their own theological perceptions. So appropriation is a contemporary term. The usual theological term that's thrown around is supersessionism.
Okay.
The idea of especially in the Pauline corpus and in Paul's letters of that Christianity supersedes Judaism. And there's a lot of discussion that's happened especially in the last 45 years in Christianity, in certain Pauline circles. They talk about the new perspective on Paul. Right. It started with E.P. Sanders, and it's still going on. I'm not a Pauline scholar, but obviously that in some ways is a response to these concerns of supersessionism, of appropriating ideas and things of that nature, and trying to look at Paul and to some extent also Jesus as trying to put them in their context of the first century, and trying to see, are they trying to do that? Are they trying to appropriate a different tradition and go somewhere else, or are they doing something else with it? And so there's an ongoing discussion that's happening there.
Absolutely.
E.P. Sanders and N.T. Wright
would be another example. Yeah. I mean, the supersessionism you're talking about led to Christian anti-Semitism in continental theology. In my understanding, that might be a leap, but after the Holocaust, a lot of churches changed how they saw the Old Testament because of this horrific act that happened.
Yeah, especially and continental. And by continental, we mean European theology and biblical studies after World War II really had some soul searching that they looked at themselves and tried to figure out, how do we do this differently so this doesn't happen again.
Absolutely.
That didn't really happen. It happened a little bit in the UK, somewhat in the UK, and in the United States, it was in its own weird place. And so I don't really know, aside from scholars who were working internationally, I feel like that what was happening in the United States went in a different direction. But yeah, that's definitely part of the discussion that was happening, especially in light of the Shoah, in light of the Holocaust.
Totally.
How do we go in a different direction? There's a sense, though, if you go back, this past week, the liturgical cycle that we're using up at our church in the Northwest had us looking at Paul and Silas in Philippi, and where there's a demoniac soothsayer slave girl who that Paul casts out a demon, and her owners are very angry about this, but they can't do it. They can't take him into they're trying to like get these people kicked out of town, right. Paul and Silas. And what the charges they use against them are the fact they're Jews. Uh-huh. And that was really striking to me because it's like, it shows that there was this anti-Semitism, that was like they're Jews, their customs are different than us as Romans, and they're like, okay, and then they arrest them and beat them and throw them in prison, and that was enough. And I mean, obviously, it's hard to take. You need to always. Acts is doing its own thing, and so but we have other instances of the fact that there is this concern again and side-eye glare at Jews throughout the Roman Empire, which flares up every once in a while. So it exists before, Christianity.
Anti-Semitism exists before Christianity.
Exactly. It already exists before Christianity, but obviously, as Christianity, especially after the destruction of the Second Temple and the parting of the ways between Christianity and Judaism, after that, it behooves, maybe not behooves is the right word, but definitely Christianity picks up and runs with the anti-Semitism of the larger culture and gives it this theological.
Sure, that's really helpful.
As it's going on there. And that, especially in the second century, you start seeing this with people, I think Justin Martyr's discussion. Justin Martyr has this extensive dialogue with a purported dialogue with a Jewish rabbi, and then it starts to already come apart like that. A good book on this, and because obviously there was a variety of Christianities floating around, we can see that in just the internal conflicts that we get. Again, that small window to in Pauline letters. Triumph of Christianity by Bart Ehrman is an interesting book.
Oh, that is interesting.
Because he talks about, sort of and Bart Ehrman has a couple of books where he's talking about sort of the different Christian traditions that don't survive and the ones that do. But that linking with anti-Semitism is something that happens early and in the context of the Roman Empire already.
So let's talk about where anti-Semitism can creep into our understanding of the Old Testament and of the Bible. I do think a lot of Christians are guilty of this and they don't know. For example, the now Secretary of Transportation, when he was running for office, Pete Buttigieg, was talking about Mike Pence, who was the vice president at the time, and extremely homophobic person, and he's a fundamentalist Christian, and Buttigieg called him a Pharisee. Can you explain why that's anti-Semitic? Like, what is a Pharisee, and why is saying this in this way, in fact, anti-Semitic?
So whenever we start talking about anti-Semitism and all that, I do need to kind of say, right, it's always a little awkward because I'm not Jewish. Mm-hmm. And so I can talk about this from a scholarly point of view, but right, there's that, it's sort of like that kind of discussion, white fragility of like white people talking to other white people about racism. It's a similar awkwardness that happens there with all the problems of that people have brought up about that text. But so I need to kind of say that as far as like I'm not Jewish. I don't have an embodied.
So you're doing it from a scholarly perspective.
I didn't bring matzah to lunch in middle school and get beat up, right? And like,
yeah.
So I just need to say that because I don't want to. It feels weird not to.
I appreciate that disclaimer.
Right. So the Pharisees, we talked about those narrow windows before, right? That we're most of the Gospels are written after, at least are finalized. At least this is where I would put them after 70, after the destruction of the Second Temple. And you have this, like I mentioned earlier, the parting of the ways of Christianity and Judaism that's happening around this time. And that situation is obviously traumatic on both sides in a way that we can't fully grasp looking at it over 1900 years later. And so that's where you get things like the corpus of Johannine, like the Gospel of John is the most extreme example of this. Both the Gospel of John and also the Johannine corpus of like First, Second, and Third John, and the Book of Revelation, where you get things like calling the synagogue of Satan and things like that. Right? It's explosive and it's raw, and both sides are very angry with each other, and so you get this portrayal of the Pharisees in the Gospels that is colored by this. The Pharisees are the ones that but the predominant sect of Judaism that kind of comes out best after the destruction of the Second Temple.
So today's Jews are related to Pharisees. You could even they're in that tradition.
Pharisaical Judaism becomes a big part of the underpinning for rabbinic Judaism that's happening post Second Temple, after the destruction of the Second Temple. I mean, obviously, it comes into a greater fruition after the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 130s. So, it's a whole like.
So when we're reading the New Testament, we're seeing the beginnings of two new faiths: early rabbinic Judaism and Christianity.
Well, but we got to be careful because it's not rabbinic. Well, two things. On the one hand, to say it's got its seeds in there, it doesn't mean that everything that's happening with the Pharisees is going to be what shows up over in rabbinic Judaism. And also, of course, the fact that there's a polemic nature to these writings. They're not putting Pharisees in their own light. It's to differentiate Christianity from what's going on in Pharisaical with the Pharisees. So calling. I mean, again, like Buttigieg calling Pence a Pharisee. And you could see the fact that the Jewish community of today takes offense to it is, in my opinion, that is the starting point for this discussion, right? Like if that they're like, oh, well, there you go. So I should, just in a similar way that if something is happening and member of like the BIPOC community is like, whoa, pump the brakes on this. This is offensive. I, as a white man, need to be like, okay,
yep,
and just kind of like back off, right? It's a similar situation. It's just a different racial minority.
Absolutely.
So there's that situation there. But the Pharisees are, again, like they're not given, they're not explained in the New Testament. They're a foil to what's happening in the Jesus movement, and so you're not going to give them a fair shake. And it's interesting because, like I said, most of the Gospels are coming together after 70, and when it's basically that's the version of Judaism that's
after the temple's destroyed,
right? And so, like, you'll get mention of like the Sadducees, but you don't really have interaction with them the same way that you do with the Pharisees. And a big part of the reason for that is that Sadduceical version of Judaism isn't really something that the people who are writing the New Testament are worried about, right? They're not talking about the Essenes at all. They're not talking about the people who are out doing the Dead Sea Scrolls stuff because they're not around anymore. The Pharisees are the ones that they're going to bring up because they're the ones who are still around.
Right.
But probably Jesus would have historically been having conflicts with all of these different sects, all these different versions of Judaism that are running around.
And Jewish people didn't particularly fit into one or the other, right? Like that's not, we have an understanding of it. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, especially
Right.
ordinary Jewish people.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like, yeah, they're a very small group that are doing a very specific thing, and not all Jews would have been Pharisees. I mean, the Pharisees are doing a very particular thing. They have a very specific view on how basically how Judaism should work and how it will survive in the context of Hellenism. And it's not the only view out there. The Essenes have a different view of what they thought would happen. The Sadducees have a different view. There are other groups running around as well that get identified as things like Sicarii and Zealots and all of that. And then again, like you brought up, there's probably the vast majority of people are kind of meh on all of this.
Totally. That makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Let's move to, I think, some common misunderstandings. If you look at the Gospels and what Jesus is doing, he by and large follows ritual purity laws.
Sure.
But somehow Christians conclude that he is rejecting those laws and the law of Moses. Why is that happening? Like, to me, a lot of people will say Pharisee, for example, and then start talking about legalistic people. To me, Jesus isn't talking about the law as the problem, but rather hypocrisy as the issue.
Right.
Why do we conclude that the law should be rejected then?
My goodness, there's like 8 different tangents there. So it depends. So part of it also, part of, we stay with Jesus for a second. Part of it has to deal with, it's not everywhere, right? It's all 4 Gospels have different views on what Jesus is trying to do. They're creating their own portrait of Jesus, as it were. Portrait's a great movement, a great word for it, because like there's part of it is the artist, the writer bringing what a very particular. None of them are photographs of Jesus; they're portraits.
Right. That's a really good way to say it. None of them are photographs; they are portraits.
They're portraits, right? And so, the artist is bringing their own stuff with it, their own biases, their own knack at storytelling, and they're highlighting certain things that matter to the people that they're making this version for. And so that's really important to recognize. And so you have, for example, I think the big one would be Matthew, where a lot of the Sermon on the Mount and things of that nature, where Jesus, I mean, it's very much, the presentation is very bold, right? Jesus goes up on a mountain and gives his law. And he'll say, and a lot of the dialogue is, you have heard it said, but I say. And that back and forth, some of the you have heard it saids are pulled from, say, the Pharisees or the Essenes, but some of them are literally just the book of Exodus. And so Jesus is putting out a new law, which doesn't completely cohere with what we have in Exodus. And that doesn't mean that he's saying, screw that, get rid of the Old Testament, get rid of all the law. If you go and even look at the different legal collections that are inside of the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible, they don't all agree. And so the idea that you need complete continuity is something that, again, humans want a lot, and especially post-Enlightenment, right. We as contemporary humans, we totally want that. But there is room for dialogue even inside of the legal traditions, especially in Judaism of Jesus' day, and also in somewhat even today, and Christianity, for its own historical reasons, largely because of the movement to Christendom and Constantine and all that, we really want to lock that down. We want we want coherence. We want everything to fall in line, and just one simple answer to everything. that became a big rallying cry, and it still pops up today with those simple answers. And things are a lot more messy than that. But part of it with Jesus is that it are those kind of you have said, but I say back and forth. But most of that stuff is happening inside the context of different traditions on how to interpret law.
Right. So he's adding to the dialogue.
He's adding to the dialogue, but it's a dialogue that's already happening in the Hebrew Bible. Michael Fishbane started this sort of, he didn't start it, but Michael Fishbane's very well known for having written a book called Intertextual Exegesis. And so basically, and where looking at places where the Bible is interpreting itself and changing its interpretation. And for him, it's the context of the Hebrew Bible. And so you'll have a text, and then another text will take it and put its own spin on it. And you have this happening over and over again. The easiest place to see those kinds of things happening are comparisons of Samuel and Kings up against Chronicles.
Absolutely.
Right, where they're the same story, but the chronicler who's writing hundreds of years later is putting his own spin on these stories, and doing his own thing. And it's, but you're already having it between the different corpora of legal material in the Pentateuch. There's 3 or 4 different legal collections in the Pentateuch. There's the Covenant Code, which is basically in Exodus. You have this Levitical Code, which is basically in Leviticus, a little bit in Numbers. You have the Deuteronomic Code, and then you have what's referred to as the Holiness Code, which used to be kind of seen as just part of the priestly code, but in the last 30 years or so, Israel Canol's work has really shown that it's its own legal thing that's going on. And probably the latest of them trying to do its own thing, kind of trying to bring all the ideas together, kind of smooth over some of the problems. But you have those 4 in the Pentateuch, but then you go off and there's a bunch of stuff about ritual purity and whatnot in Ezekiel, and it doesn't fit with anything we've seen so far. Or you'll have law, rituals explained to you in Samuel, in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and they don't make sense. With anything that we know from Leviticus or Exodus or Numbers, they're doing sacrifices in ways that don't seem okay at all. And yet all of this stuff is in the Bible.
All of it's in the Bible.
We want, so there's a dialogue, there's a discussion about those things and what's okay and what's not okay. But it's all part of an in-house discussion. What makes the stuff with Jesus in the New Testament what makes it more fraught, obviously, is the fact that, Jesus can be understood as new perspectives have been doing over the last 30 years or so, can be understood as part of the in-house discussion of Judaism of his day. But then you have the parting of the ways, the complete parting of the ways between Christianity and Judaism. And so it gives those things a different spin later on.
That makes sense to me. So what you're saying is that there's dialogue that Jesus is bringing that's already happening in the Old Testament between the Deuteronomistic history, which is exilic, if I'm not mistaken, and then the Chronicles, which is post-exilic.
Yes.
So even the context that the readers are receiving this are much different. So I always thought of Chronicles as being this is general, but it seems happier.
It's happier. What I think is interesting is it on some hands, on some things they're much more they smooth out some theological problems and try to put a better task on things, but they also do a better in some ways. They smooth, you don't have David and Bathsheba, right? You're David's always doing good stuff. But in Chronicles, it's very concerned in Chronicles about David looking good, but at the same time, issues of this where you get the names are probably more of authentic, because there were a lot of people who had names that had Baal as part of it, and that gets smoothed over in the exilic stuff that's happening in the Deuteronomistic history. But then so like Mephibosheth, Bosheth means is this word for that's usually thrown in where Baal would be there originally.
And so interesting.
Yeah, so some of the names have been are changed. So it's interesting.
Is Judaism moving from?
They both have their own theological agendas. That's the interesting thing. Like for when we've said this a couple of times, the Deuteronomistic history is for those who don't know, are the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Right. They're kind of one big block that was probably edited during the exile as they're sitting there like saying, what did we do wrong? How the hell did we wind up here? And they're trying to kind of bring it all together. And so obviously one of the things that comes out a lot in that discussion is we followed after the foreign gods and we didn't do what we should have been doing in Deuteronomy and those kinds of ideas.
Right.
And so they're trying to understand their own trauma, to be honest, as they're sitting in exile and trying to figure out what do we do now. Whereas Chronicles is written in the Persian period, and it has a different set of concerns and different other things it's worried about. But it's not really worried about it. They're back in the land. And their concerns are different than how did we get here? How did we have the first temple destroyed? And will we survive as a people? The concerns are different, and now it's about we need to hype this new second temple we have.
Right.
Talk about how it's awesome, and how do we deal with the fact that we're part of this giant Persian Empire.
So I think the context really matters. They're in dialogue together. When we see the dialogue happening in the Old Testament, in the Bible, what does that teach us today about how to use the Bible? Like you're saying, post-Enlightenment, largely, we're not seeing the dialogue. We're trying to make it all fuse together. But, the first two chapters of the Bible are different accounts of creation, right? You have two different histories of Israel in the Old Testament, four different portraits of Jesus in the New Testament. So throughout, and even competing theology in the New Testament between, for example, Paul writing to the Galatians or the Romans, and then what appears to be James responding directly to Paul.
Right. And then you've got Hebrews doing its own thing too.
Right.
You've got James, you've got John, you've got Paul, you've got what's happening in
Peter too.
Peter, right? All those and what's interesting is one of the first kind of decisions of the church to say something's heretical was the attempt to boil down the four Gospels to one simple portrait. There was something about that embodiedness of these four different versions that was important, and having those four different perspectives. And that's very important. And we need to that those ideas of dialogue and dissonance are allowed in the Bible itself, in the Old and New Testaments. And I mean, like from a musical point of view, if you're listening to music and you want a little dissonance, right? Okay, I like jazz, so I like those spicy dissonant chords that you sometimes get, but you want that tension, and then it resolves back on something you can all agree on. And those kinds of ideas are important to realize that that's not just in music; it's also in other aspects of our life, right? Holding that those tensions. We all have that, right?
Totally. Christians often differentiate between, I hear this often among evangelicals particularly, between the God of the Old Testament and then the God of the New Testament, as if they're different gods altogether. And it feels to me like I hear evangelicals say, look, the God of the Old Testament's angry, and they're quoting from Joshua and Judges, these brutal passages. And then the New Testament God's nice. So what's up with that?
I don't know if I got in trouble, but I did. There was a period of time where I was teaching at an evangelical school, And someone brought up like, seems like we're dealing with a very different God in the in the New Testament as opposed to in the Old Testament. It's like, yeah, I mean, you got this loving, caring God in the Old Testament, and then you've got this mean, angry God in the New Testament. And they all looked at me and they're like, what? And I was like, the God of the Old Testament is not going to send you to hell. There's not a hell in the Old Testament. Like,
Jesus threatens hell all the time.
What was that?
Jesus threatens hell all the time.
Right. There's a bunch of times in the Gospels where it's like hell and damnation, hellfires. And so, yeah, there's, so it was a way of turning the idea on its head. The students were not amused, but the point is, like, we see what we want to see on some of these things too, right? And there is parts of the New Testament that are amazingly brutal. And the idea of, forsaking your parents and all of those kinds of extreme breaks that get thrown around in the Gospels, which are there for very real reasons. Again, probably due to this larger Jewish Christian parting of the ways. It's recognizing where the hearers are in their own faith journeys. But 2,000 years removed, it looks really brutal. And so, yeah, so you can pick out and piecemeal those kinds of arguments to make the opposite points as well. Joshua and Judges are great examples of putting things in its context. We were talking about the Deuteronomistic history, and that idea of these books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are one big block. If you read Joshua, for example, as the end of the Pentateuch, a hexateuch, which is how some scholars want to read it.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's the triumphant, like Team America version of
it's nationalistic history.
It's very much like, yeah, they go in, they kick ass. But if you see that as the beginning of a text that winds up in exile, if Joshua is the beginning of the slow move to exile, it changes entirely how you're reading the text. Even these things where it seems amazingly positive, when you have that long view of, but where we're going to end up is exile, because we don't do what's right, and we're making these poor decisions. It really changes how you look at things.
Right.
And again, so any religious tradition has places where you can look at it as the fire and brimstone moments. Yeah. So it's one of those things. It depends on what, again, like I feel like it's easier to talk about this stuff after 2 years of COVID, because I think we can all relate a little bit. Hopefully we can all relate a little bit more to being able to let people sit with their trauma.
Exactly.
Like Psalm 137, which is the Psalm.
Happy is the one whose enemies are dashed, whose enemies' infants are dashed to the rocks or something.
Yeah. It's like, starts off by the waters of Babylon, we wept. And then it's like, blessed are those who bash the babies' heads against the rocks. And you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. You're like, but it's coming out this profound place of trauma that you can kind of recognize it as, wow, I hope I don't have ever lived through something where I feel that way. If
you see the trauma and the oppression, it lends itself to why wrath, vengeance, imprecatory psalms even exist. And I would say, for me, permits me to pray imprecatory psalms in my own oppression, in my own despair, in my own feelings of exile even. So John Goldengay out at Fuller, I took classes with him when I was in seminary, and he always said that the Psalms are 150 different ways you can pray to God, which is, again, like that kind of, there's a polyvalence, there's stuff in there that, I would feel uncomfortable if I was singing it on a Sunday morning, but it's okay. And there's points where you're there, and we need to have that, be able to have those spaces, to have that kind of language, to like call God out, to yell at God the way some of these Psalms do. Absolutely. So the dialogue in the Old Testament, the contextual understanding of it, whether Israel's in exile or not, they affect how we read it. And then throughout history, there have been events such as the Enlightenment, such as slavery,
Protestant Reformation,
the Protestant Reformation, the Industrial Revolution, the Holocaust. These huge events change us as interpreters and as understanders. What events should we pay attention to now to change how we, like, what's happening right now? Well,
that's the hard thing, right? Like as anyone who, right. So one of the things I teach at Temple, besides, and I'm housed in intellectual heritage, but I also teach history ancient to 1500. And it's always that moment of, so I sometimes I have on my literary hat or my religion hat, and sometimes I put on my history hat. And it's hard to, the reason why history takes a while to write is because you need that space to understand these larger systems. So it's hard to say for like, what is the thing right now, because we're in it. I don't know if where we have an imperfect perspective of this. I keep on talking to people about this. Like I remember growing up, my grandmother had gone through the Great Depression, and she would do weird things. And I remember having these conversations with my mother, like, why does she do this? It's like, well, she went through the Great Depression, and so, like she doesn't trust banks. She hides money in her mattresses. Things of that nature.
Totally.
And I mean, like a whole host of things. And so I'm wondering, what is it that in 20, 30 years, our kids are going to have to explain to our grandkids about the weird things that we're doing because we went through this trauma right now, like over the last 2 years. The ongoing trauma of all of that, whether in between COVID and this extreme far right ideology becoming more mainstream in our culture.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like all of those kinds of things. And so it's hard to know. One of the big things we have to watch for, though, are those that desire to put things in lockstep. Which has already happened politically on the right, more or less. There are a few outliers there, but it's also, there's a big movement on the left. Like, you just got to get in line and always vote the same way. And like, they're, and understanding that so much of the Bible, so much of our tradition is built on dialogue and having room for different voices, which isn't something that our culture really we have a problematic relationship to it. We say we're okay with it, but then we're not. And so having a room and a space for that to work out our stuff, and for having different ideas play off each other, when there's this movement, at least in the political ecosystem, towards doctrinal purity of the left and the right now, it's a little frightening to watch.
I think when we have collaboration about common goals and common ends, we can welcome political and intellectual diversity. I think it becomes trickier when our common goals and common ends are frayed. So it's hard for us to have a dialogue, for example, between someone who thinks police brutality isn't a problem and Blue Lives Matter, and someone who just wants to stay alive because they're Black.
Yes.
Like and I mean, I write about this myself, right?
Oh yeah. And I'm realizing in the way you're responding, like, yeah, I'm not trying to push towards some like Walter Whitman neoliberal, all perspectives are the same, and
and I know you are.
But yeah, you're right. There's a version of this that creates very unhealthy dialogues between people who like, let's have, these perspectives need to be balanced against each other. Are these people or not?
Exactly.
You have to look at both sides. Like, no, they're like, if you're going to deny the humanity of somebody, that's a big issue.
Absolutely. There's not very fine people on both sides. If one of them is white supremacist and the other, if one of them wants people of color dead and the other just wants to exist.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'll say this. When we talk about historical events, like in recent times, I think we can see how the Vietnam War and the Cold War has shaped how we understand the Bible. But for me, the global war on terror and 9/11 radically changed how I understood the Bible and pacifism in general. And it's changed how I understood the Bible. So my experience as an Arab American in the United States during this time, seeing how the Bible was used by war hawks to justify invading Iraq and Afghanistan. But then also for me, seeing how it motivated me and changed me to protest those wars and to own my own dignity. So I wonder if we'll see a movement again right now, post Donald Trump, post insurrection. So like for me, pay attention to how these events change how we understand the world and what we know about it.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because that kind of like extreme militant view, the late 80s, early 90s were lousy with like extreme militarism in songs, and it was
absolutely
very chill. It was the end of the Cold War. There were a couple of little things going on, but the United States, it wasn't like when things started ramping up in the in the movement to the turn of the millennium. But we already had all of those songs ready to go in the thing. So yeah,
absolutely. It's really interesting how that worked.
Yeah. Those, I think of like mighty warrior dressed for battle, calling God the commander in chief, which was like, I remember being a teenager, like, what? Why is suddenly God's the president of the United States? What? That seems a little problematic. But there you go. But I feel like in looking back at that now, I'm like, those are some of the seeds potentially of Christian nationalism. That idea of equating those things. I mean, we can go and look at the weirdo paintings of Donald Trump that became popular.
Totally.
Like Messiah Trump. That we could kind of see now we can see that trajectory. So yeah, I don't know. What's also interesting to me is, especially in the United States and all that, where we are with dispensationalism. We didn't talk about that at all. So dispensationalism is this theological idea.
Are you seeing a resurgence of that now?
Well, no. That's what's really interesting to me is so dispensationalism. This idea that usually tied to the Bible has different dispensations, different distinct parts of time and space, and it was a way of sort of bracketing off different theologies. I remember growing up in a church where like they were, like you read like the Sermon on the Mount, and blessed are the peacemakers, sell all you have, give it to the poor, all those ideas. And like, well, that's not for today. That was put in a different dispensation than the church is today. And it was just it's very cozy. You can put anything you don't like in the Bible in a little box and say, well, that was a different dispensation of time. And you don't have to wrestle with it, right? You just put it over here with some kind of like Jim Crow theology. It's like separate but equal. In any case, but along with that came this radical, pre-tribulation rapture. God can come back at any moment. That kind of apocalypticism, and that was was part of the non-engagement of the conservative right. It was like, we're not going to even worry about this. Why rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic when it's going down, right? We're just trying to save souls and do this other thing. But given that we have this resurgence of Christian nationalism and this extreme desire to legislate a specific version of Christian understandings of laws, we seem to be moving into almost like a new millennialism, Like it's not
That's
like
interesting.
we're waiting for Jesus to come back to fix everything. We're going to do it here and now. I'm not part of that but like we're going to legislate everything. We're going to create the kingdom of God on earth in this. And I don't, at least it seems like that's kind of what's going on. It's almost like the social gospel movement of the early 20th century, it has turned into this like Christian theocratic movement of the early 21st century. Not that they're the same groups, but like that seems to be a big movement in the United States. And I'm wondering what that's going to where that's going to go. Like, I don't know. Like, we're in the midst of it. Like I said before, like hopefully 100 years from now, someone's writing this history and trying to figure this stuff out. We're living it right now, but there's a big tension inside of conservative Christian theology between this new theocratic view on things versus that radical apocalypticism that's was
really
part
interesting.
of the movement 20 years ago. And so, I don't know where that's heading, but it's definitely, I feel like that's something I'm keeping an eye on right now. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about with the Hebrew Bible, but so
where just to cap off the interview, where do Christians today stand to grow the most when it comes to understanding the Old Testament and how to use it? Can you give our listeners things to pay attention to, things to watch out for? We've already discussed a lot.
Right. That's interesting because, as an academic scholar, we tend to kind of look at the text itself and look at in things. We're not trying to, this is more of your role as a
pastor. Do this.
But one of the things we didn't really get a chance to talk on it much, but oftentimes becomes a big rallying point in different discussions between the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament and the New Testament and Christian versus Jew and all those kinds of things. There's the role of ritual. And, talking about like the dead rituals of the Old Testament as opposed to the living faith of the New Testament, which is, it's a dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. But at the same time, there's that partially because I grew up in a very fundamentalist environment that was very much against those kinds of things, or said it was, although they created their own rituals. That is something I've been drawn to in my own life and my own research. Those, what are these rituals? Why are they here? How do they work? What are they trying to do? And that kind of aspect of things, the ritual life, those intentional things we do, both the ones that are in the Bible themselves, but also that we do as part of our shared life as a local body. Those are the places where I find it very helpful. And again, not necessarily like this is going back to what you were bringing up, that idea of like co-oping or something like that. Yeah, I'm not talking about like we should all, build sukkots and live outside like that. No, that's not who we are. That's not part of the Christian tradition. But that idea of the embodied life and some kind of cyclical view as well. Right. We have the church calendar, but oftentimes in Protestant circles, it gets downplayed. It's there to help ground us to our faith, to our traditions, in the same way that going up to Jerusalem 3 times a year, and later on in Judaism, reading these texts in their entirety 5 times a year, or one with these 5 texts throughout the year, are designed to create social,
absolutely
bring us together as a community. That's one of those places when we're reading the Hebrew Bible to look for analogous situations, not to try to co-opt what's being done there. Absolutely. Realizing that that's part of what we need to avoid those fray ends that you were talking about before. Absolutely. By trying to keep us all together.
Yeah, so paying attention to ritual and how it shapes us, I think, is important. And I think Protestants in particular need to pay attention to this because we've removed a lot of ritual. And I would also say Anabaptists too. So talking to a lot of our listeners.
Anabaptists have a lot of problems with this too.
So pay attention to how. And I think it's nice that like Julie's using the lectionary, so am I, to form us around something. You know, we're observing communion every week in our meetings now as a centerpiece, you know, so things are changing. And I think that helps people have a breath and participate in something that they don't have to invent on their own and individualize on their own, which is good as we move out of this individualistic idea of salvation.
Yeah. I mean, we all spent, over a year just living as little boxes on other people's screens.
Totally.
I think the idea of getting together and being bodily with people and doing things with the community of believers is something that we're appreciating more than we did in the before times. We've recognized it more after we haven't had it for a while. Agreed.
And we also learned how to include people who can't be in person with us, who are disabled and otherwise. So it expanded our whole sense of who we were.
Yeah. And that's really important as well. Those discussions, and trying to include as many people as we can who are in that, because we've all been there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, Jim, we're going to end this interview, but I want people to know where they can find you and reach you. What are good things? Can we follow you on social media anywhere?
Yeah, sure. I'm usually on Twitter. I took some time off for Lent, which was good. I gave up doom scrolling for Lent.
Oh, that's good. What's your handle?
I'm just Jim Getz at Twitter. At Jim Getz, right? That's my
Jim
Twitter.
That way. Is there anything you're writing or working on right now that you want us to know about?
I am technically, as of Sunday, this past Sunday, I'm on sabbatical.
Oh,
so,
great.
I guess I don't have to teach again till January.
Excellent.
And I'm working on Gilgamesh stuff, basically.
Okay.
Wrote a couple of different side projects on the Epic of Gilgamesh. So not really Bible per se. There might be some Bible stuff that winds up spinning out of it. I know. I'm working on a new translation of Gilgamesh.
Wow.
But there's a couple of other things that are going to pop up. Things that are already planned. I need that translation for and will be related to it. But there might be some more biblical related stuff that comes out of it as well. Don't know yet. Don't know until you get really deep into these projects.
Well, thanks so much for spending this time with me and this conversation. It was really fun.
Cool.
Thanks for being here with us. Jim Getz is awesome. I hope you got to enjoy that part with Jonny and us together. We like to end our time together on these episodes by sharing what's been feeding our souls lately. We call this spiritual show and tell. If you remember, I don't know if you ever had to bring something special in to school, in elementary school, and show it to the class. But this is our little show it to the class. What has been nourishing you recently? So, pastors, I pose that question to you.
I went to a concert last week it was it nourished my soul. It was such a powerful experience. We went to see Joy Oladokun, and she was at, we meaning Steve and I, she was playing at the Ardmore Music Hall, which I'd never been to before. It was very small, so it was very close. And there was something so powerful about Joy's music. I'll start by saying, has been part of the backdrop, the soundtrack of this last year. Steve has been listening to her, which means I've been listening to her. I rarely will come in the room and put on music, but I always appreciate when he does. And I just have slowly tuned into the lyrics. And her songs are beautiful and heartbreaking and profound and prophetic. all of the above. Anyway, so it was really exciting when we saw that she was playing locally, and we got there and found out that friends from Circle of Hope were sitting right in front of us, which was really fun. So the whole experience of the concert just nourished my soul because it was powerful and beautiful, and also just really great to experience after, 2 years of not going to public events like this.
That is so sweet. What's nourishing my soul is a children's picture book called The Arabic Quilt by Aya Khalil, or I would say Aya Khalil. It's a story of an immigrant family from Egypt, and I really loved it. It really touched me because it related so much to my experience. So I just want to read you a passage. And I'm going to link the YouTube video where someone is reading it out loud, so you can experience it that way. And you can also buy the book. That'd be cool too. They're at the breakfast table. So this is the scene, and I'll probably annotate it. Breakfast is delicious. Egyptian fava beans, so we eat that for breakfast. It's called ful medemis, which is cumin, tahini, lemon juice, olive oil. It's tasty stuff. Egyptian fava beans, homemade French toast, and watermelon with feta cheese and mint, which I recommend to you, by the way. That's a nice little combination there. Watermelon longs for the salty. Zachariah has watermelon juice dripping down his chin. He looks happy. I packed your favorite lunch for you, a kufta sandwich, Baba exclaims. Kufta is like a spiced meatball. And probably tucked into a pita with like some vegetables and tahini sauce. Shukran, which means thank you. Shukran, Baba, Kanzi says, but secretly wishes her Baba would pack her a peanut butter and jelly sandwich instead. Her family had just moved to this town and she doesn't know anybody. And she doesn't want to be different. Like, I felt like Kanzi has felt. Where, like, I didn't know where it was coming from. She's more self-aware than I am, right? But, like, Mama would give me pita bread with PB&J in it. And, like, that wasn't the right vessel for it. It was supposed to be, like, on Wonder Bread or something. But that's what we had. So that's what I brought, And I remember just feeling different. And kind of feeling left out and being a misfit. And that formed me as a person. And this story is sweet because the school becomes inclusive and they celebrate her culture and so on. So it's kind of like a fairy tale. But it's sweet for that reason. But it really touched me that someone could see me in my experience in a way that I so rarely have felt. Like the specific Egyptian quality to this makes it tailored to me, and that's just a really special experience, and uncommon. So that's nourishing my soul. I think because, God in the person of Jesus sees me in the same way, right? Jesus becomes like me too, and feels me too, And the New Testament's sweet because, for me, because it has a lot of Middle Eastern Arabic qualities to it, right? So that's special too. Which is also why, like, I refuse to allow Christianity to be colonized by Westerners, because it has a more rich history than that, but that's my experience. But Jesus sees me like that too, and relates to me like that. And when I get to have experiences with others who can see me and relate to me, I learn how God sees me too. So that's really important. That's why you'd want to create a diverse church. That's why you'd want to do that. So that people feel seen and known and loved, and they can experience the love of God that way too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jonny. My soul nourishment comes out of Mother's Day this time. I enjoy that that holiday, even though it's a Hallmark holiday, the celebration of women and life givers, even in all the complication of that, we talked in our meeting about how creation is groaning, like our mother God in childbirth, all the longing and suffering in that, and there's lots of complications to it because none of us have had a perfect experience of being mothered. Some of us have lost children. Some of us are in the throes of very difficult seasons of parenting. Some of us don't have any children and really long for that. So there's a lot of different kinds of experiences that go into this day. But we were highlighting Jesus as mother. Even Julian of Norwich talks, who is one of my favorite mystics, talks about Jesus, God actually birthing us from the cross, and then nourishing us with his own body. So it kind of breaks down the gender limitations of this whole image around mothering, and I love that because Jesus is actually inviting us to the communion table to be actually nourished by his body. So he's continuing to feed us as a mother. Anyway.
That's such a beautiful image, Rachel.
Oh, I love it too. My husband reads a lot. I like to think I read a lot, but he actually reads a lot. And he's reading this book called Elephant Company. And he was telling me, he told me this sweet story that I shared on Sunday. And I just want to offer it to you. It's a true story about, a mama elephant and her 3-month-old baby calf. This little baby girl elephant had fallen into a ditch that was now like a river. And it was the beginning of the monsoon season. And the baby was like, the mom was dipping down with her trunk. The mom was up on the bank trying to scoop the baby from getting swept away by this river, and it wasn't working, and the mom and baby were both getting really tired, and the rain is just coming down like in a downpour, and it's nighttime, and finally the mother jumps into the river herself, and in this like Herculean effort throws the baby up onto the bank, and in doing so is washed down the river herself. And the observer is just kind of watching the baby there shivering on the bank, crying, and thinks it might be the end of the story. But a couple hours later, the observer hears this sound, this like wail that sends chills down his spine, and it's the mother calling back for the baby. Somehow she had gotten out of the river downstream and was now coming back for her child and searching for her with this wail, and they find each other and they are reunited. And I just think that speaks to our Mother God, who will go to the nth degree to save us and to find us when we're lost and shivering and needing that care. So that's been nourishing my soul, hanging on to that image of Mother God. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for listening and being here. I hope this conversation blesses you. Like Jonny said, please share it if you like it, and let's be together again next time.